Every shot fired tells a tale. Subscribe today and uncover the legends of the Wild West. The Sierra Nevada mountains stretched wide and unforgiving, their jagged peaks glistening with snow even in the summer months, their valleys whispering with winds that seemed to carry secrets older than memory itself. It was here, in the shadow of those granite giants, that fortune and ruin would collide in a single man's desperate gamble. His name was William S. Bodie, a prospector whose boots were worn thin and whose lungs rasped from years of chasing dreams across the wild and restless frontier. Bodie had heard the stories, rumors of shining veins of gold hidden in the barren ridges above Mono Lake, whispers carried from saloons and campfires where men clutched tin cups of whiskey and dared to imagine striking it rich. Most laughed at him, called him a fool chasing ghost veins, but Bodie pressed on, convinced that destiny still had something to offer him. The year was 1859, and the land was raw, untamed, and indifferent to human ambition. One autumn day, with his shovel biting into the cold earth, Bodie's persistence was rewarded. He uncovered flecks of yellow in the pan, tiny fragments of the metal that could turn paupers into kings. It wasn't a strike that shook the world like Sutter's Mill a decade earlier, but to Bodie it was proof that his wandering had not been in vain. He set up a crude camp, huddling against the winds that howled down from the high ridges, dreaming of the fortune that would rise from this lonely ground. He did not live long enough to see that dream realized. The following winter, while struggling to bring supplies through a blizzard, William Bodie was lost to the cold. His body was never recovered. Yet the gold he found had already begun to draw others, and though his name would be misspelled into Bodie, his ghost seemed to linger in every gust that swept across the barren hills. The trickle became a stream. Prospectors, gamblers, and drifters followed rumors of Bodie's discovery into the Sierra, trudging through snowfields and dust storms, building shacks from rough-hewn timber. The first cabins were little more than wooden boxes on the wind-scoured plain, pitched against the biting cold and the loneliness of the mountains. By lantern light, men huddled over pans of gravel, chasing specks of gold that winked in the firelight like promises of salvation. For every man who struck a pocket, 10 more cursed the earth and swore the mountain mocked them. Still they stayed, because in the frontier mind, hope was stronger than hunger, and the whisper of gold was louder than the roar of the storm. By the early 1860s, Bodie had begun to take shape, not as a city but as a gathering of stubborn souls. The town was a crooked scatter of shanties, tents, and rough saloons, where whiskey was cheaper than water and colder than the Sierra nights. The women who came, some following husbands, others chasing opportunity of their own, sewed curtains for drafty cabins and lit candles against the gloom, trying to carve a slice of civilization from the wilderness. Children played in the dust outside while men with sunburned faces and swollen hands trudged to and from the diggings, their eyes fixed always on the ground, as if salvation lay buried beneath every stone. But with every new arrival came new tension. Not all who came to Bodie came seeking honest fortune. There were men with fast guns and quicker tempers, gamblers who carried their livelihoods in hidden decks of cards, and drifters who stole more than they mined. The mountains became a crucible, melting together ambition and desperation, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with restless energy. By night the saloons echoed with the clash of glasses, the thump of boots on warped floorboards, the shuffle of cards, and the sudden sharp crack of a pistol when tempers ran too high. More than one prospector's body was found in the dirt alleys by morning, his pockets turned inside out, his dreams ended with the twitch of another man's finger. Still, Bodie grew. Word spread of promising claims, and though the Sierra was cruel, the thought of easy wealth burned hotter than fear. By the late 1860s, wagons creaked into the valley carrying not just miners but merchants, blacksmiths, and opportunists of every stripe. Storefronts appeared, rough but proud, selling flour, beans, pickaxes, and the illusion of permanence. Churches were raised beside saloons, as if heaven and hell had agreed to stake equal claims on the town. A makeshift school opened, its wooden benches filled with children whose eyes darted constantly toward the mountains, where their fathers and brothers vanished each morning in search of glittering treasure. Yet Bodie was never entirely at peace. It was a place of extremes: wealth and ruin, joy and sorrow, faith and violence. The winters were long and merciless, winds howling through gaps in cabin walls, snowdrifts burying homes and graves alike. Supplies often ran thin, and hunger gnawed at bellies as fiercely as the cold gnawed at fingers. But then spring would come, thawing the ground and revealing the promise of new veins, and hope would surge once more through the crooked streets. Men who had sworn to leave packed their pans and picks again, convinced that just one more strike might lift them into the ranks of the fortunate few. It was in this crucible of hardship and hunger, of ambition and sin, that Bodie's true character was forged. It was never meant to be a town of balance or moderation. Bodie was excess carved into timber and stone, a place where human greed met the indifference of the mountain and refused to back down. Every plank hammered into a saloon wall, every nail driven into a cabin roof, seemed to declare the same stubborn defiance. We will take what this land owes us, even if it kills us. And often it did. In the flicker of lamplight, men told stories of Bodie himself, the lost prospector whose bones lay hidden in the snow. Some claimed to have seen his ghost wandering the ridges, a solitary figure stumbling through the storm with a shovel over his shoulder, forever searching, forever cold. Others swore the wind carried his laughter, mocking the living as they repeated his folly. But whether spirit or shadow, his presence haunted the growing town, a reminder that Bodie was born not just of gold, but of sacrifice. And as more cabins rose, as the streets filled with the smoke of cooking fires and the cries of children, the legend grew with them. Bodie was no longer just a camp. It was becoming a town, rough and raw, beating with the pulse of 1,000 restless hearts. What no one knew then was that the gold would carve not just fortune, but a curse. For in the Sierra, every glint of promise came with a shadow, and every dream carried the echo of its own destruction. Bodie's story had only begun, and already the wind seemed to whisper warnings in the night. Boomtown of sin. Bodie's golden age. By the mid-1870s, Bodie was no longer just a cluster of cabins clinging stubbornly to the Sierra. It had erupted into a boomtown, pulsing with noise, ambition, and sin. The discovery of rich new veins drew thousands, swelling the population to over 10,000 in a matter of years. From a distance, the town looked like a patchwork of timber and tin scattered against the harsh ridges. But up close, Bodie was alive with the feverish energy of people who believed they had found their fortune, or would die clawing for it. The main street stretched dusty and uneven, lined with buildings that leaned drunkenly toward one another as if conspiring about the secrets buried in the earth beneath. More than 60 saloons blazed with lantern light, spilling music, laughter, and curses into the night. At every corner, gamblers huddled over tables, shuffling worn decks of cards while women in painted rouge and silk dresses drifted through the haze of smoke, their laughter masking exhaustion. Bodie did not sleep. It throbbed with a rhythm all its own. Whiskey-fueled, gunpowder-laced, a song of greed and survival played louder than the winds that shrieked outside the town limits. It was said that in Bodie you could buy anything for a price: a drink, a woman, a gun, or a man's silence. Respectable merchants built storefronts, general stores stocked with flour, beans, coffee, and tools, but they competed with brothels where velvet curtains concealed whispered bargains and drunken laughter. Blacksmiths hammered iron in smoky forges while opium dens glowed dimly, their patrons sinking into dreams sweeter than the cruel reality outside. Churches stood, too, their bells tolling on Sundays, but even their sermons seemed drowned out by the saloons where pianos played ragtime until dawn. Heaven and hell lived side by side in Bodie, separated only by the width of a muddy street. The violence was constant, a drumbeat beneath the chaos. Disputes over claims turned into duels in the dust, the outcome often decided by who could draw the fastest. Men fell in alleys, shot in the back for the gold dust they carried in their pouches. Lawmen tried to impose order, but the badge carried little weight in a town where every man's pistol was his own authority. The undertaker grew rich, and graves multiplied on the hill overlooking town, each marker a testament to a night gone too far, a hand too quick, a temper too sharp. Children grew up learning the sound of gunfire before they could read, and mothers rocked babies to sleep, to the soundtrack of distant shouting and the mournful wail of fiddles from saloon doors. Bodie's reputation spread quickly across the West, carried in stories that grew taller with every retelling. It became known as a sea of sin, a place where vice wasn't hidden but celebrated. Parents elsewhere warned their children about Bodie as if it were hell on earth, a pit of debauchery and danger. And yet, for every soul who cursed its name, 100 more packed their wagons and headed for the Sierra, drawn by the promise of fast money and wild living. To some, Bodie was ruin. To others, it was freedom. Even the prayers of children captured the town's paradox. In a letter home, one child famously wrote, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodie." The words, whether misheard or darkly true, became a legend repeated in hushed tones. Some said the child meant it innocently, believing Bodie to be heaven. Others swore it was a cry for salvation, a recognition that the town devoured innocence and spat out corruption. Either way, the phrase stuck, etched into the myth of a place that seemed suspended between damnation and redemption. But not all was misery. For some, Bodie was opportunity incarnate. Fortunes were made almost overnight. Gold dust poured from the mines, filling the coffers of the lucky few who struck rich. Saloons overflowed with champagne for those who could afford to toast their victories, while dance halls shuddered under the stomping boots of miners eager to forget the backbreaking labor of the day. For a brief, shining moment, Bodie glittered as bright as the gold pulled from its veins. Families dressed in their best walked along the boardwalks, children clutching sticks of candy, women in bonnets exchanging gossip while their husbands swapped tall tales of strikes and misfortune. For them, Bodie was not a den of sin but a chance to build a life, however precarious, in the shadow of the mountains. Still, the darker side of Bodie never slept. Drunken brawls spilled into the streets. Thieves prowled, waiting for miners too drunk to notice their pockets being cut. And always, the looming threat of fire haunted the town. Lanterns hung carelessly in wooden buildings, stoves burning hot in drafty shacks. Every flame was a reminder that Bodie's heartbeat, as fierce as it was, might one day burn itself to ash. Yet no one cared. In Bodie, tomorrow was a distant thought, and the present was a blaze of cards, whiskey, and gold. The Sierra winds carried whispers through the night, and some swore the mountains themselves resented the town. Shadows moved strangely at the edge of the lamplight, and miners who worked late in the shafts returned with wide eyes, muttering about voices in the tunnels, echoes that did not belong to them. A few men disappeared altogether, swallowed by the earth they were so desperate to tame. Their names faded quickly, replaced by the next wave of hopefuls arriving on weary horses, determined that the gold was worth any risk. At its height, Bodie stood as one of the wildest towns in America, a place where greed and grit ruled every waking moment. It was alive, furious, unapologetic, a town that seemed to dare God himself to strike it down. And though few admitted it aloud, everyone felt the unease beneath the revelry, a tension coiled tight in the dusty streets. Bodie was burning fast, like a match flaring bright in the dark. And deep down, the people knew such light could not last forever. Fire, blood, and echoes in the dust. By the time the 1880s arrived, Bodie had become a legend whispered across the West, a town where fortunes rose and fell as fast as a coin tossed in the air. But beneath the surface glitter of gold and the rowdy music spilling from saloons, shadows lengthened. The town that once pulsed with wild energy now carried the scent of smoke and blood, as if some invisible hand was tightening its grip around Bodie's throat. Violence was not new here. It was the marrow of Bodie's bones. On any given night, the boardwalks echoed with the crash of fists, the crack of pistols, the screams of the unlucky. A man could be dead for the price of an insult, sprawled in the dust while the piano inside the saloon never missed a note. Stories traveled fast. The gambler shot in the back after a crooked deal, the miner stabbed in a drunken fight over a woman, the merchant found with his skull cracked open, his strongbox emptied. In Bodie, the line between life and death was thinner than the smoke curling from a cigar. The graveyard on the hill swelled with markers, wooden crosses weathered by the relentless Sierra winds. Locals gave it a name, Boot Hill, for so many had died with their boots still on. Widows wept, children carried on with hollow eyes, and the town simply drank more whiskey to forget the echoes of gunfire that haunted the nights. Some claimed the ground itself had grown cursed, poisoned by the blood spilled into its dust, and perhaps it had. For Bodie was changing, and the change came not with celebration, but with fire. The first great blaze struck in 1892. It started, as so many disasters do, with something small. A tipped lantern in a boarding house, a careless flame left too close to kindling. Within moments, the wind seized it, hurling sparks across rooftops, igniting buildings faster than men could shout warnings. Flames roared down the main street like a beast unchained, devouring saloons, shops, and homes alike. The air was thick with smoke and screams, the night lit orange and red as if hell itself had clawed its way up from the mines. Families ran carrying what little they could, blankets, a Bible, a photograph, while others fought desperately with buckets of water that vanished into steam before they touched the fire. By dawn, much of Bodie was reduced to charred ruins, a skeleton of the town that had once stood defiant against the mountains. But Bodie did not die that night. The survivors rebuilt, stubborn as ever, hammering nails into scorched beams, raising walls against the wind once more. For a while, the town seemed to breathe again. Yet something had shifted. The fire left scars not just on the buildings but on the souls of those who lived there. People spoke of hearing voices in the ruins, shouts, screams, the frantic cries of the dying, long after the flames were gone. Children avoided the blackened shells of buildings, whispering that shadows moved inside even when no one stood there. At night, some swore they smelled smoke drifting through the streets, though no fire burned. Then came more blood. A string of murders rattled the town in the years after the blaze. A saloon owner shot dead behind his bar, his killer never found. A prostitute strangled in her room, her body discovered by a fellow girl who swore she saw a man's shadow slip out the door, only for it to vanish into thin air. Miners disappeared down shafts that were later found collapsed, though no one could say what caused the cave-ins. Fear spread like fever, and Bodie's reputation as a place cursed by its own sins deepened. Newspapers across the West printed sensational stories, painting Bodie not as a town but as a warning. Still, people came, drawn like moths to the flame, unable to resist the lure of gold even as it destroyed them. The final Great Fire came in 1932. By then, Bodie was already a ghost of its former self. Its population dwindled to a few hundred hardy souls clinging to a dream that had long since turned to dust. When the flames came again, some say from a boy playing carelessly with matches, others claim by darker causes. The town had no strength left to fight. The fire swept through with merciless hunger, consuming what little remained of Bodie's proud main street. This time, the town did not recover. Charred skeletons of buildings stood silent against the mountain sky, their windows gaping like the eyes of skulls. What had once been a roaring boomtown of sin and fortune was now a carcass, abandoned to wind, dust, and memory. But Bodie did not vanish entirely. Its bones remained, preserved in the thin, dry air of the Sierra, and with them the whispers, Travelers who passed through in the years after the last fire spoke of strange sounds carried on the wind. A woman's scream cut short the stomp of boots on wooden planks, the sudden sharp crack of a gunshot echoing across empty streets. Some claimed to see figures standing in the windows of ruined houses, pale and watchful, vanishing when approached. Others reported hearing the mournful strains of a piano, drifting on the night air, though every saloon had long since burned to ash. The living began to speak of Bodie as if it were alive still, though in another way. They said the town remembered, that it carried within its ruins the voices of those who had died violently, their stories etched into the walls and streets. The fires had burned flesh and timber, but not memory, not sorrow, not rage. Bodie had become something more than a ghost town. It was a wound, frozen open, refusing to heal. Those who left carried the stories with them. The curse of Bodie grew from these tales, that anyone who dared to take even a stone, a nail, or a scrap of wood from the ruins would be punished. Letters arrived from faraway places, travelers returning trinkets they had stolen, claiming illness, accidents, and tragedy had befallen them since leaving. Whether superstition or truth, the curse became as much a part of Bodie's identity as its gold had ever been. And so Bodie endured, not as it once was, but as something darker and stranger. Fire and blood had stripped away the flesh of the town, leaving only echoes. And those echoes, carried by the relentless wind through the Sierra, whispered, still telling the story of a place where greed burned too hot, where violence took root too deep, and where even the flames could not erase what had been done. Decline. Into silence. The fall of Bodie. The fires had gutted Bodie, but it was not the flames alone that killed the town. It was time. Time, with its slow, merciless erosion, gnawed away at Bodie more thoroughly than any inferno. By the dawn of the 20th century, the veins of gold that had once fed the town's frenzy began to run thin. The miners who had arrived with dreams of riches found only dust at the bottom of their pans, and even the luckiest claims no longer yielded the wealth they once promised. Fortune had turned her gaze elsewhere, and Bodie was left staring into the hollow eyes of its own decline. The streets that had once roared with laughter and gunfire grew quiet. Saloon doors creaked open less often, their piano keys collecting dust, their bottles untouched. Merchants shuttered their shops, packing wagons for towns where business still flowed. Families who had endured the bitter winters and violent summers finally surrendered, their houses left furnished but empty, as though the inhabitants had simply stepped outside and never returned. Within a decade, the bustling sea of sin that had shocked the West shrank to a few hundred stubborn souls who refused to leave, clinging to a past that no longer had a future. The silence was eerie. Boardwalks once worn smooth by boots now groaned only under the weight of the wind. Dust rolled like tumbleweeds through empty streets. Horses, once tied outside every saloon and brothel, vanished, their hoofbeats replaced by the lonely call of crows circling above. The sound of gunfire, once as common as church bells, faded into memory. In its place came something stranger, the feeling that the town itself was listening. Travelers who passed through spoke of the unsettling quiet, a silence so deep it pressed against the ears like a weight, broken only by the faint creak of a shutter or the distant slam of a door that no one had touched. Those who remained spoke in whispers of the Bodie Curse. It was said that the town demanded loyalty, that anyone who took even the smallest relic, a coin, a nail, a scrap of wood, would suffer for it. Stories spread of men who pocketed trinkets only to meet grisly fates, a miner crushed in a cave-in, a traveler thrown from his horse, a woman struck ill with no cure. The letters began arriving, packages returned to Bodie with stolen items inside, accompanied by frantic notes begging forgiveness. Some came from across the state, others from across the country. One man wrote that his marriage collapsed the moment he carried away a rusted horseshoe. Another swore his child fell gravely ill until he returned a small bottle taken from a saloon shelf. Whether curse or coincidence, Bodie's silence grew heavy with the weight of these stories, as if the town itself refused to let go of what remained. Legends whispered through the Sierra. Children claimed to see pale figures watching them from cabin windows. Travelers swore they heard music drifting across the empty streets. The faint, ghostly echo of a piano striking chords in a saloon long since burned to ruins. Miners passing the graveyard on the hill reported voices in the wind, laughter cut short, or the desperate cry of someone who had died with their boots on. Even the living began to move carefully, as though they feared to disturb something slumbering beneath the earth. Bodie was no longer just a town. It had become a mausoleum, a place where time itself seemed frozen, preserving every sin, every sorrow, every scream. By the 1920s, only a handful of families remained. They lived among the ruins, their children playing in streets where weeds grew through cracked boardwalks, their nights lit by lanterns that seemed swallowed by the vast darkness pressing in from the mountains. The last mines closed, their shafts collapsing into themselves like open mouths choking on dust. What wealth remained was not worth the cost of digging it out, and so the earth reclaimed what men had stolen, burying gold beneath rock and silence once more. The desert won, as it always does. Yet even in decay, Bodie resisted death. Fires might have consumed its heart, gold might have abandoned its veins, but the town refused to vanish completely. Its wooden buildings stood stubbornly against the wind, their glass windows shattered, their doors hanging loose, but still they remained. Inside, beds were left neatly made, chairs pulled up to tables, poker hands frozen in mid-play. It was as though the people had stepped out just moments ago and never returned, leaving the town suspended in a breath that never ended. Visitors described it as walking into a dream, or a nightmare, where time had stopped, where the living had been replaced by shadows of themselves. The Sierra storms battered the ruins year after year, but Bodie endured. Some said it was because of the curse, that the spirits of the dead refused to let their town die. Others believed it was stubbornness, the same stubbornness that had built Bodie from a patch of dirt and snow into a city of gold. Whatever the reason, Bodie remained, a ghost clinging to its bones, a whisper carried on the wind. We are still here. By the 1930s, Bodie was spoken of in hushed tones as the most haunted town in America. Ghost hunters and thrill-seekers crept through its ruins, claiming to hear footsteps trailing them through empty houses, to see curtains shift when no breeze stirred, to feel hands brush against their shoulders in rooms where no one stood. The stories piled up, each darker than the last, until Bodie became more myth than place. It was no longer simply a dead town. It was alive in a different way, pulsing with the memories of those who had lived and died within its borders. In 1962, California claimed Bodie as a state historic park, but not in the usual sense. Bodie would not be restored. It would not be polished or rebuilt into something new. Instead, it was preserved in what the caretakers called arrested decay, a state between life and death, between ruin and preservation. Roofs would be patched to keep the rain out, but walls would remain weathered, glass broken, paint peeled. Bodie was to be frozen exactly as it had been left, a portrait of decline captured forever in wood and dust. The visitors who walked its streets would not see a town reborn, but a town held captive in the moment of its dying breath. And so Bodie lingered, neither alive nor dead, cursed yet celebrated, a monument to both human ambition and human folly. Its silence was its story now, its empty houses telling tales louder than any living voice. To walk through Bodie was to walk through time itself, to feel the weight of all that had been lost and all that refused to be forgotten. In the end, Bodie did not fade into silence. It became silence. And in that silence, its legend only grew louder. Ghosts of Bodie. Frozen in time. There is something unsettling about walking into Bodie today. The Sierra winds still cut sharp across the valley, carrying with them the scent of pine and dust. but the silence feels heavier than it should. It is not the silence of nature, but of something held back, as if the air itself remembers too much. The town sits frozen in arrested decay, its buildings sagging yet still standing, each one whispering of the lives that once filled them. To wander Bodie's streets is to wander through a dream suspended between life and death. Step into the old saloon and the bar still waits, its shelves lined with bottles clouded by time. The piano sits in the corner, its keys yellowed, its silence more haunting than any song it once played. In the schoolhouse, lessons remain half-written on chalkboards, tiny desks lined neatly as if the children had simply stepped out for recess and never returned. In one cabin, a rocking chair faces the window, its seat hollowed by the weight of someone long gone, as though they might return any moment to sit and watch the street. Bodie is not abandoned. It is paused. But for many, it is more than paused. It is haunted. Visitors report footsteps trailing them on empty boardwalks, the creak of a floorboard where no one stands, or the sound of voices rising faintly from saloons that haven't served a drink in nearly a century. Photographers often find strange figures in their frames: a child staring from a window, a man in a wide-brimmed hat, a woman's face hovering just behind their shoulder. Some laugh it off as tricks of the light, others swear they felt the breath of something unseen brush against their neck. And then there is the curse. Bodie's curse is no campfire story. It is written in letters, hundreds of them, sent back with stolen relics. A rusty nail, a bottle stopper, a scrap of wood, all returned with desperate apologies from those who claimed misfortune struck the moment they took them. Divorce, sickness, accidents, financial ruin. The pattern was undeniable. "I beg you, forgive me," one letter read, its handwriting shaking. "Ever since I took this piece, my life has been nothing but suffering." The item enclosed was nothing more than a bent spoon, yet it carried with it the weight of fear. Whether coincidence or true curse, Bodie holds on to its possessions with a jealous grip. Park rangers and caretakers tell their own stories. They say when the sun dips behind the mountains and shadows stretch across the streets, the town comes alive again. Curtains sway in windows. The sound of boots clicking across the boardwalk echoes down alleys. A child's laugh, high and fleeting, carries on the wind, only to vanish in the blink of an ear. One ranger swore he saw a light flicker in the abandoned church at midnight, though no lantern or candle remained inside. Another confessed that he avoided looking too closely into the windows after dusk, because more than once someone had been staring back. Yet Bodie's power lies not only in its ghosts, but in what it represents. It is a time capsule, a frozen reminder of the boom-and-bust frenzy that built the West. Every building is a story. The saloon that heard too many confessions, the jail that held men with death in their eyes, the boarding house where laughter and tears rang from paper-thin walls. These are not just ruins. They are echoes of ambition, greed, violence, and resilience. Bodie is not history written in textbooks. It is history breathing, waiting, watching. As the decades passed, Bodie transformed from a gold-hungry inferno to a sacred relic of America's frontier soul. Families drive into the valley expecting a ghost town of empty shells, but what they find instead is something stranger. A place that feels alive in its absence. The silence is not dead. It hums. It presses against your chest, demanding that you acknowledge it. Bodie's greatest treasure is no longer gold. It is the weight of memory, the way the town itself holds on to the past and refuses to let go. Some say Bodie survives because it wants to be remembered. The miners, the gunslingers, the gamblers, the children, even the innocents who paid the price for others. Sins. Perhaps their spirits refuse to let their stories fade into the dust. Perhaps that is why the curse is real, because the dead demand respect. So if you ever find yourself driving the lonely road into the Sierra Nevada, and the wind begins to whistle a little too sharply, and the mountains seem to lean closer with every mile, you will know you are approaching Bodie. And when you walk its streets, remember this: you are not walking alone. Every step is accompanied by those who walked before you, their shadows layered over yours, their voices carried on the silence. Do not take anything, not even a pebble, for Bodie does not forgive, and Bodie does not forget. And yet, as haunting as it is, there is beauty in Bodie's survival. To stand there is to touch the past directly, to feel what it meant to gamble everything on fortune and to lose it all. Bodie's ghosts are not only spirits, they are lessons. They remind us that greed has a cost, that ambition burns bright but fast, and that even in ruin, stories endure. That is the true curse of Bodie, not death, but remembrance. The town will never let go of its story, and if you walk among its ruins, you may find that it will not let go of you either. So tell me, would you dare to step into Bodie's silence? Would you walk those frozen streets and face the ghosts that wait there still? If this journey into the haunted heart of Bodie gripped you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell for more tales of the Wild West where history and legend collide. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you risk carrying something from Bodie home, or would you leave it untouched? Let's hear what you think, brave traveler, because the West is never truly dead. It waits in silence for those bold enough to listen.